Have you ever spoken with someone and thought they weren't acting like themselves? Maybe a cool and reasonable person suddenly becomes angry and aggressive.
Isn't it about time you grew up and acknowledged our situation? Right now, you're useless to me.
Or more frightening, realized you weren't acting like yourself.
Sorry, that was uncalled for. I'm just really tired.
The idea that our personality can wildly change even in daily life is scary. If you can suddenly behave like a different person, then who are you really? But life shows us that humans just aren't that simple. This realization is one of the core ideas of Persona. Trying to understand why people can vary like this and what that means is a constant element of the series. To understand these games, you need to understand how they explain this. This will be the third of our foundational videos about Persona. It will build on my videos about the realms of Persona and the nature of desire. You may want to watch those if you want more context. This time we'll be talking about what Persona calls the many selves each of us harbors. This idea underpins Shadows and Personas, but also many other parts of the series. We'll start by seeing what the Persona games say about these selves, then look at Carl Jung's psychology that the games are based on, and what they mean in that system. Then come back to see how Jung's ideas inspired many aspects of Persona. The most complete explanation we see in the games is in Philemon's Power of Persona lecture. Let's listen to that first, and then see what it's saying.
But tell me this, are you aware of the many and varied selves you harbor within you? The self suffused with divine love, the self capable of demonic cruelty. People live by wearing different masks. Your current self may be only one of those innumerable masks. You, though, you have a very firm grip on your identity. I respect your strong will. In return, I grant this power. Persona. It is the power to summon the selves within you, the gods and the demons you harbor.
That was kind of dense, so let's list out the points he makes. We each contain many selves. These selves are hugely varied. Philemon describes them as capable of divine love or demonic cruelty, meaning these selves fill the entire range of human possibility. For any personality within the range of human potential, you have a self like that within you. We can wear these selves as masks when we interact with the world as a tool. We need a strong sense of self to properly use these masks as tools. Other games in the series have their own introductions, but they don't explain as much as Philemon's here, though they do put more emphasis on the idea of wearing masks to protect ourselves.
A persona is a facet of your personality that surfaces as you react to external stimuli. You can think of it as a mask that protects you as you brave many hardships.
Personas are one of these kinds of selves, and they're as good a starting point as any. So, what are personas? The name persona comes from a Latin name for the masks that actors would wear in plays. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend watching the 1966 film, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. It is an attempt to make a classic-style Roman comedy play as a modern movie. It's pretty hilarious, and remarkably faithful to the ancient genre. Roman actors would put on masks in the plays in order to discard their personal identity and assume the role of a character. But these weren't just characters from a play. These were stock characters. Basic characters who would be used again and again in different stories. Usually a Roman comedy would star a young man named Adolescens, which literally means young man. He would be trying to accomplish something, most often trying to court a young woman named Virgo, meaning young woman. He would usually be accompanied by a slave, Pseudolus Servus, false slave, who would be much more clever than him, and would help solve his problems or try to fix his mistakes. He would also have his father, Senex, old man, and his mother, Matrona, matron. He would often be rivaled by Miles Gloriosus, the glorious soldier, who would be an accomplished soldier, but cruel and arrogant.
I, oppressor of the meek, subduer of the weak, degrader of the Greek, destroyer of the Turk, must hurry back to work.
The reason these actors would wear these masks was not just to conceal their identities, but to reduce friction for the audience. A person you don't know is a cloud of possibilities. They are something unpredictable and demand your focus. But once you saw the actor was wearing the mask of Senex, you knew exactly what to expect of him. You could relax and not spend any energy thinking about that. As Jung saw it, this principle doesn't apply only to ancient theater. It is just as essential in our day-to-day relationships. Think of how you act at work or in school. You might be less assertive than usual. You might not say certain things and will be more likely to do as you're told. Then compare that to how you act when you're with your friends. Now you are probably much more open and assertive. These are very different personalities, and neither is really the true you. Jung called this phenomenon persona, because we assume these personalities as freely as an actor assumes a character. These personalities we assume aren't simply an act we decide to perform. We usually don't think about what role we've assumed, and we don't consider how we should act in light of our role. We only do that when the role is new to us, or when something happens to throw us off script. Normally, we just think about what we should do, and it comes out in a way fitting to the role. All of this suggests that the persona isn't just an attitude that we assume, but a kind of separate self. Something distinct from the thinking, conscious part of our mind. Something that can in some way think separately from the rest of the mind, and in its own way. Jung called the conscious, thinking part of our mind the ego. As the ego makes decisions, the persona plays the part of acting them out in the world. The persona is a kind of emissary for the ego. It smooths over our interactions with the outside world, so we can balance our attention between the inside and the outside. That's why in cognitive realms, where the mind can directly alter reality, the persona appears as a separate entity. It acts on the world on behalf of the ego. For Jung, that is how the mind works, so that is what we see when the mind's workings are made visible. Most people take on personas intuitively. We figure out where we fit into a group, and begin playing that part without giving it much thought. When you gain some understanding of personas, you can become active in this. You can consciously craft personas that fit your situation, and choose from the full spectrum of human possibility. And then you can don them when the moment is right. But how are we able to craft this vast range of personalities, and how are they able to so naturally play out so many different roles? To answer that, we'll need to dive deeper into Jung's concept of complexes. Complexes are a kind of splintered off fragment of the mind. They are a clump of mental content, ideas, memories, images, that group together and function as a kind of mind within a mind. Because these are splintered off minds, the personality of a complex can be completely different from that of the ego. That might seem a bit fanciful, but we have already seen how personas can have distinct personalities. Personas are one kind of complex. Another kind of complex can be one where a person's personality suddenly changes when bringing up a topic. Someone who is normally very reasonable might suddenly become very aggressive and angry.
Right now, you're useless to me.
Someone else might freeze up the moment they hear a certain phrase.
Enough of your arrogance, no good Torah!
What?
In this case, one of these alternate personalities, a complex, has suddenly activated and stolen control from the ego. Complexes like these usually form because there is some aspect of ourselves that isn't being properly expressed by the ego. There's some desire we aren't pursuing, some frustration we aren't addressing, some fear we are ignoring. We can ignore any of those things for a while, but that doesn't make those feelings and energy go away. If the ego doesn't address them, then something in the unconscious will, and that will cause a complex to grow. Sai's complex that causes her to have bouts of anger are because her public image and her self-image both demand that she be constantly calm. Her feelings of anger are never allowed to express themselves. The energy attached to that anger is never allowed to dissipate, and so they accumulate and coalesce in a complex. Because all those feelings have some amount of energy to them, when that complex activates, it has a huge amount of energy and can overpower the ego and cause her to lose control. Yoshida's complex that causes him to panic when he hears the phrase, "no good Torah," is based on past emotions that he has never worked through. His past as no good Torah is so disturbing to him that his ego becomes unable to function when presented with it. He represses the memory so that his ego can function, but that also means that he can never actually work through those feelings. That memory then becomes the core of a complex that flares up whenever he is reminded of no good Torah. To understand why complexes work like this, it's best if we see what they actually look like. At the heart of every complex, there are two essential things. The first is some sort of personal content. It could be the memory that triggered the complex's formation. This memory is effectively frozen, and it dictates the tone of the complex. If the memory is one of anger, the complex will always be angry. If it's one of pain, then the complex will always be in pain. If the memory was formed during childhood, then the complex will always be a child, even after the person has become old. The second essential part of a complex is a sort of universal content. This can be what is called an archetypal image. An archetypal image is some mental image that to an individual is an especially good representation of an archetype. Archetypes are essentially ideas that humans instinctively understand. Throughout history, there have been certain ideas that have been so constant that they have been a part of life for nearly every human being who has ever lived. They've been ingrained not just in our cultures, but in our very biology. Our minds naturally recreate archetypal ideas. The archetype of the complex will dictate how the complex sees the world. In my video on desires, I talked about how instincts release energy into the psyche, and that energy seeks out ideas that can satisfy that instinct. The archetypes create patterns of thought that are well fitted to our instincts. We can think of them as two sides of the same coin. The instincts give the energy to drive the mind, and the archetypes give structure to the mind to channel that energy. As such, archetypal images tend to be magnets that attract desires and psychic energy. That is why personas often take the form of characters from myth and folklore. The reason why a story becomes elevated to a myth is because it conveys archetypal ideas exceptionally well. When we hear a story, we recreate its characters and events in our mind, and if they resonate with us, that will attract psychic energy from our instincts. We experience that as a compelling story, something that rings true on a deep level. If they are particularly good archetypal images, they will naturally attract a lot of energy in many people, and so become immortalized as myths. Personas take the form of mythical figures because every complex has an archetypal image at its core, and mythical figures are ideal archetypal images. If the many forms of personas we see are persona's set of archetypal images, then the arcana are its set of archetypes. One interpretation of the major arcana of tarot is that each arcanum represents a stage of life, a role we must play, a person we must meet, or an experience we must go through. This very closely matches Jung's idea of the archetypes as being aspects of life so typical that nearly every human being experiences them. The Fool arcanum represents the beginning of a journey. The Fool is a naive figure, full of unrealized potential. We all play the Fool as we are born into the world, and play it many times again as we learn new skills and undergo new adventures in life. The Emperor and Empress arcana represent leadership roles, both literal rulers and metaphorical rulers, like the mother and father roles. We all interact with authority figures of some sort playing these roles, and if you've ever been in a leadership position, you've probably had to play one or both of them yourself. The Tower arcanum represents disaster. We all face hardships, and at times life will seem unbearably painful. Jung called this archetype the deluge because in myths it is often depicted as a great flood. The ideas that the archetypes represent are each broad, encompassing a wide spectrum of possibility. A single archetypal image can only capture a fraction of that spectrum. An image of a king could be of a just and wise ruler, or it could be of a tyrant, but it cannot be of both. The collection of all archetypes represents the full spectrum of human possibility, with each archetype being a sliver of that spectrum, and each archetypal image being a sliver of its archetype. Every complex takes on an attitude toward the world, based on that central memory and its archetypal image. That means that complexes have a very narrow viewpoint, and are incapable of understanding ideas that don't fit inside that worldview. In other words, the worldview of a complex is always distorted. Usually complexes are idle. They sit in the back of our mind and don't do much. But when something happens that resonates with that core memory, they spring to life. The effect can be subtle or drastic. Complexes can pull our attention away from things, or give us a gut feeling about someone or something. More extremely, they can give us a rush of emotion that seems to come from nowhere, or even take control completely. Complexes can grow beyond their core by assimilating other content that resonates with the complex. These could be ideas that affirm its worldview, feelings that are consonant with it, new memories that echo that core, or desires that the complex can promise to satisfy. All of these, in turn, can create new ways the complex might be activated. If something happens that isn't close enough to that core memory, but can be a reminder of one of these secondary parts, that still may be enough to awaken the complex. This may allow the complex to begin growing more and more, and become a serious rival to the ego itself. Now that we have a basic idea of what complexes look like, let's see how Persona presents them. The game that most thoroughly explores complexes is Persona 5. That's because its focus is on what creates a distorted worldview. I've talked about how the metaverse shows reality as a person perceives it, but it will help to go into more detail about this. We do not perceive reality directly. Instead, the outside world passes through many filters before it reaches our conscious awareness. Our eyes send us two big grids of color. One filter combines the two images we see into a single one. Another recognizes patterns and uses that to identify objects. Still another compares these objects against our memories and attaches feelings to those objects based on that. That is the level where complexes can subtly manipulate us. With their distorted perception of reality, they will attach feelings and associations to what we perceive. As much as we like to imagine our decisions are always based on careful thought, they're usually based on our emotions and gut feelings. Our rationalizations come later to justify our choices rather than decide them. Complexes can make us act like we're in a very different world than the one we think we are in. That is what the metaverse really shows us. A palace is effectively a projection of how a complex sees a part of the world. Kamoshida has a complex that imagines himself to be a king. Not just any king, but a conquering king. He has won his domain through his might. And as far as the complex is concerned, that means he is entitled to all of the spoils within. It is not conceivable to this complex that that could be wrong. Even if he's not consciously thinking that, the complex will alter his perception to give him the feelings as though he were. The structure of a palace imitates the structure of its complex. The outermost layers present the face it shows to the world, and the content becomes more intimate to the complex as we approach the innermost sanctums. That will have to be its own video. But let's look at the very innermost core of a palace. That is, of course, the treasure. And that treasure embodies the core of the complex. That personal memory combined with an archetypal image. In Kamoshida's case, we learn that it is his Olympic gold medal. Remember, an archetypal image is something that to an individual represents an archetype. And to Kamoshida, that medal is the most perfect image of a king's crown there could be. When the Phantom Thieves remove that archetypal image from the complex, the core that holds together the entire complex is shattered. Archetypes provide the structure to our minds. Without that archetypal core, the structure of the complex disintegrates, and it breaks apart into a bunch of loose content in the unconscious. Because that complex held a great deal of energy, all of the content that once made it up will still retain that energy. High energy content naturally tends to rise to the level of consciousness. Before, it had been bound up by the complex, but now that it is free, it will eventually come into contact with the ego, which will have to deal with it. That is what a change of heart really is, showing someone the reality of a complex, cutting away all of the illusions and forcing the subject to look into the naked truth of themselves. It is a cruel fate, but turning our conscious eye toward the parts of ourselves that we don't want to see is the only way to truly transform ourselves. And that brings us to one last kind of complex that we need to talk about. One dedicated to make us see those parts of ourselves that we don't want to look at.
We call them shadows.
Before we go into much depth about shadows, it's important to understand that what persona means by shadow isn't always the same as what Jung means. Persona calls basically any part of the unconscious mind that takes on a physical form, a shadow. For Jung, the shadow is a very specific kind of complex. So what is that complex? The shadow archetype is the idea of the version of you that embodies all of the aspects of yourself that you wish weren't there. It's the basis of the doppelganger, or the monster in the mirror. Because it is built on that archetype, the shadow will naturally accumulate the parts of yourself that you are most ashamed of. If you want to believe you are kind, then your shadow will be cruel. If you want to believe you are strong, then your shadow will be vulnerable. Whatever traits you hate in yourself will be exemplified in your shadow. The shadow has a very special role in the psyche. As Jung saw it, the key to growing as a person is to embrace the parts of ourselves we can't accept and find ways to integrate them. The shadow exists to help us do this. Its purpose is to find those parts of ourselves that we can't accept, but that are important, in other words, high energy, and bring them to the ego's awareness, and then to apply whatever force is necessary to make the ego accept them. In the same way that Persona 5 gives us the best demonstration of complexes, Persona 4 gives us the best demonstration of shadows. Each party member's shadow is a shadow in the Jungian sense. They take something that the conscious mind cannot accept, and demand that it be faced and accepted. The shadow has a broader viewpoint than most complexes. The archetypal idea of another you is a very sweeping idea, but its perspective is still distorted to a degree. It knows the content it holds is extremely important, and that the ego needs to accept it, but it can't understand the cost of that. It only knows that its content must be accepted. That's part of why the TV world is so dangerous to ordinary people. The shadow is perfectly willing to take the ego hostage in order to meet its goals. Any dangers of that are simply too far outside of its perspective to even be considered. Compare that to the boss shadows in Persona 5. These are not Jungian shadows. Instead, they are personifications of the same complex that creates the palace. They are critically different from a shadow. As far as they are concerned, nothing needs to be changed. They fight to maintain the status quo. From their fixed perspective, they are doing something that is necessary, something the ego doesn't have the strength to do. While a shadow will do anything to ensure that its content becomes conscious, these will do anything to ensure that it does not. We do actually see several true shadows in Persona 5, but most of them are not called shadows. Persona 5 places a great deal of value on the will to rebellion. The courage to face what is wrong in the world, and to try to make it right. In every party member, this has been repressed by some circumstance of life that made them decide that they simply had to go along with society's flaws. Their personal sense of justice has become part of their shadow. When they decide to embrace rebellion, they hear a voice that urges them forward. That voice is their shadow. When they tear off their mask, that represents revealing what the persona has been hiding, the shadow. They gain the power of persona by accepting their shadow. And that is maybe the most core message of Persona. These many selves within us include some utter monsters. Persona is not afraid to show us that these can drive us to utter evil. But we can't just wish these away or try to ignore them. In the best case, that just makes us powerless. And in the worst case, that can turn us into the monster. The only option left to us is to face these selves. It will be terrifying. It will be shameful. It will be painful. An idea that Jung brought up many times in his work is the alchemic maxim of in sterquilinis invenitur. In filth it will be found. It is in the place that you least want to go that you will find the thing of greatest value. The treasure is always guarded by the dragon. And it is by looking face to face with the person you most despise that you can begin to be the person you truly want to be. And that will conclude our foundational videos, at least for now. Now that the foundations are laid, I can start really talking in depth about the stories. There is a lot in the pipeline, but let me know if there are any topics you would like to see covered. The next video has taken several solid days of reading to research, and will include my own translation of some extremely important pieces of Persona lore that have never been released outside of Japan, alongside some cosmology, tarot reading, and classic horror literature. I'll see you guys next time.